Riesenhafte Silhouetten schimmern die Leiber der KdF-Schiffe durch den Hafendunst zu uns herüber. Drüben hinter den St. Pauli-Landungsbrücken, drüben an der Überseebrücke und im Strandhafen liegen sie. Die Monte Olivia, die Oceana, die Stuttgart, die St. Louis, die Sierra Cordoba und der Deutsche. Heute Mittag beginnt für Tausende dort drüben. Und wie oft haben wir das hier in Hamburg erlebt, dass glückliche, begeisterte Volksgenossen, denen das Meer draußen zum Erlebnis geworden war, zurückkehrten.
Hamburg, the 5th of May, 1937. Amongst the dockyards of the great port city, and with a backdrop of the great passenger ships of the nation, the dock workers, the people of Hamburg, and the citizens of Germany gather.
Immer wieder braust der Jubel empor an dem schlanken Leib des neuen Schiffes. Der Führer zeigt sich. Hoch recken sich die Arme der Tausende, die hier auf dem Werftgelände stehen heute früh.
Karl Kaufmann, Gauleiter for Hamburg, speaks to the crowd and welcomes der Führer Adolf Hitler to the port city.
Hier auf der Werft in Hamburg auf das Herzlichste und Freudigste begrüßen zu dürfen, ist doch dies Ereignis, das wir heute feiern und begehen. Ein Ereignis, das in der Welt einmalig dasteht. Wir grüßen Sie aber auch in tiefer Dankbarkeit, dass diese Werft wieder hämmert, dass diese Schiffe gebaut sind, dass dieser Hafen wieder erfüllt ist von pulsierendem Leben und dass darüber hinaus ein jahrhundertelanger Traum Groß-Hamburg Wirklichkeit geworden ist. Das danken wir den Führer. Wir grüßen den Führer. Der Führer siegt! Sieg!
The citizens of Germany, who flocked to the harbour walls and slipway like Hitler himself, have come to see the first ship to enter into the service of the KdF, the Kraft durch Freuden, or the Strength Through Joy initiative. The gleaming white hull towers over those around. Flags emblazoned with a swastika flutter in the spring breeze as the horns of the surrounding ships hail the maritime history. Now, a lady steps forward. She's thin, wearing rimless glasses, her hair pinned tight, dressed in black. She reflects a sombre occasion, rather than the triumph that the newsreader and speech-givers proclaim. She herself speaks.
Ich taufe dich auf den Namen Wilhelm Gustloff.
Und nun zerschellt die Sektflasche am weißen Bug des jüngsten deutschen KdF-Schiffes Wilhelm Gustloff.
There's a crash, and a bottle of white sect breaks and spills against the side. A stain of white spills down the deep red paint beneath the waterline. The ship careers towards the water, from land with no name into the sea bearing the name Wilhelm Gustloff. The Wilhelm Gustloff, launched by the namesake's widow, would become infamous. Yet who was the man whose name would become forever attached with this vessel, that later would literally go down into history? Welcome to the Achtung History Podcast, written and presented by myself, Simon J. James. This week, Hitler's Swiss Enclave, the story of Wilhelm Gustloff. Wilhelm Gustloff entered the world on the 30th of January 1895 in the North German town of Schwerin. A picturesque town on the great flat plain surrounded by lakes and trees, dominated by its ancient but romantically restored castle. This town, tranquil and reclusive. But yet so was the rise of Wilhelm, of which there is little to be said. All that is noted in these early years is that he trained to become a bank clerk upon his completion of his secondary school studies. But it is not in Schwerin where Wilhelm Gustloff would have an impact. And from this moment on, until our close, we leave Schwerin and its flat lands behind. When World War I broke out, it tore much of Europe up. Not just land, but families. Many on all sides were eager to go to war, but as the troops of the Kaiser's armies marched with leather pickelhaube on head and rucksacks on back, Wilhelm Gustloff was left behind. A victim of tuberculosis, his constitution was not up to the task of waging war in the trenches on eastern or western front. Whilst, therefore, the troops marched, Wilhelm Gustloff, at the age of 21, travelled south to the mountainous retreat of Davos to partake in the cure. Like so many others whom suffered from consumption, as TB was so casually known, the sanatoriums of Switzerland were supposed to offer a reprieve for the ailments of that horrid disease. Within these walls, doctors would perform whole ranges of remedies, from bleedings, purgings, the deflating of one lung so that it could rest, through to exercise and, most importantly, rest, fresh air, and eating well. The Swiss sanatoriums became a treat for the unwell wealthy. Wilhelm did not, however, fall into the class of the wealthy. So his stay in Davos had to be earned, which he did so by serving Germany. In Davos stood a meteorological station that, despite being on Swiss territory, belonged to Germany. It was here, high in the Swiss Alps, that Gustloff worked away the war by preparing weather maps. Switzerland, despite being neutral, was not immune from the effects of the war. A nation that had industrialized prior to the war, its wealth stemmed from international trade, with the future Allies accounting for 43% of Swiss exports, and the Central Powers 28%, with the principal three exports being textiles, watches, and machinery. The first years of the war had brought a boom in the economy as a neutral nation, but by the time of Gustloff's arrival, this boom had ended and the powers, Allied and Central, were waging war with one another via Switzerland. Neither side wanted their goods traded with Switzerland to end up in the hands of the enemy, and thus two bodies were established. The Schweizerische Treuhandstelle für Überwachung des Warenverkehrs, or STS for short, and the Swiss Society for Economic Surveillance, or SSS for short. The SSS, ruled by the Allies, wished to hasten the Central Powers' defeat by economic defeat, and thus invested much more in their SSS. By 1918, SSS officers employed over 400 people, had guards stationed along the Swiss frontier, and had established offices in London, Paris, Rome, and Washington. Whilst this was a success for the Allies, it caused Switzerland to suffer, as so many of its imports came from Germany. But with the SSS limiting imports to only its regions, only Swiss firms that were exporting goods were able to turn a profit. By war's end, Germany could no longer afford the weather station that employed Gustloff, and took the decision to transfer it to Swiss ownership. However, this was little consolation. When war came to a close, due to the defeats of Germany and Russia, Switzerland's foreign investments were crippled. Reduced from a once high of 8 billion francs down to 2.5 billion. The Swiss economy was standing on a precipice. With this precipice also came a fear of the spreading of Bolshevism that seemed to be emanating from the east towards Central and even Western Europe. A spread that even the mountains could not provide shelter from. The fear of the spread of Bolshevism grew even larger with the declaration by labor unions and the Social Democrats of a national strike on the day of the armistice, the 11th of November, 1918. Gustloff was shattered by the news of the surrender of Germany. He also found fear in the Red Terror. From upon high in the Davos retreat, the world below seemed to be collapsing into hell. Germany itself, in Munich and in Berlin, saw the proclamation of communist governments, both ultimately collapsing, however. In Switzerland, the government, having witnessed the chaos unfolding in its northern neighbour, sought to put into place securities. In 1920, Heinrich Rothmund, a trained lawyer, was placed in charge of Switzerland's police. As director of the police, he had the power to implement his own personal philosophy, and as such, he established a new police force, the Fremdenpolizei, or the Foreigner Police. Its principal task, to keep foreigners out of Switzerland, and amongst these there was one particular target, the Jewish people. With the chaos in the former Russian Empire, new pogroms against the Jewish people were waged. With this, many Jewish people fled the east, hoping for a better life further west. In Switzerland, many feared they carried with them Bolshevism. Others within Switzerland bore the disdainful disease of anti-Semitism. Rothmund wished to stem the flow of Jewish people in Switzerland, constructed a barrier of red tape. His Fremdenpolizei acting to turn away would-be applicants, and thus the Jewish population between 1920 and 1941 fell from 20,979 to 19,429. For the next few years, the economy in Switzerland struggled forth, and so did Gustloff. The Red Terror eased as Europe, and in particular Germany, began to find its footing on unstable ground. In 1923, Gustloff ventured down from this mountain retreat. Travelling across the border to Germany, he visited the Bavarian capital Munich. And as fate would have it, whilst he was in Munich, he witnessed Adolf Hitler giving a speech to a crowd of his National Socialist supporters. Gustloff, so enamoured was he, that he joined the party himself, took on the party literature and returned to Davos, a preacher for this new National Socialist cause. Davos itself was seeing a return of tourism, particularly the Germans. Thus it slowly grew to be an almost unofficial enclave of Germany. Yet the isolation which Gustloff had positioned himself within through the war years and chaos of the years that followed had isolated him from the realities that those in Germany had suffered. Those realities, starvation, political turmoil, hyperinflation, had led to many, if not most, not wishing to hear of solutions to delusional realities. Therefore, Gustloff's preaching in Davos of National Socialist rhetoric was an inconvenience and disturbance to the Germans. However, it did find favour amongst the Swiss. It was in this manner that Gustloff continued for the coming years. He served as a member of the Deutsch-Völkischen Schutz- und Trutzbundes, which became infamous for being the most anti-Semitic of the far-right organisations. Amongst its members it counted future SS Oberstgruppenführer Kurt Dellueger, future Reichsprotector of Bohemia and head of Wannsee Conference Reinhard Heydrich, future Hamburg Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, and the abominable Julius Streicher, editor of Der Stürmer. Over the next years, Gustloff would work his way up the ranks, becoming known amongst his party comrades for his devotion to the party, but especially Hitler. Ernst von Weizsäcker, who would later become the German ambassador to Switzerland, wrote of Gustloff's admiration for the Führer. He adored Hitler to the extent of idolatry. He often looked at the Führer's picture for hours on end, in order, as he told me, to gain strength. But for those years, the National Socialist cause was weakened by the result of Hitler's failed putsch of 1923, for which he initially landed in jail and then, upon release, was faced with a speaking ban. The party's support suffered, one because of Hitler's forced withdrawal from the limelight, secondly because for those years, despite political instability, things just didn't seem too bad. Then came the Wall Street crash. Like the war, Switzerland was not immune to the crash. 100,000 Swiss lost their jobs, a small number in comparison to many other states, but a number that made the Swiss authorities uncomfortable. It was at this juncture that Hans von Viel founded the political movement aimed towards the petit bourgeois, a movement he called the National Front. It was a party that opposed Freemasons, monopoly capitalism, inheritance tax, Marxism, and Jews. Small business owners were the keys to the party's support. Small business owners, family business owners, who were told Marxism wants to take your business, inheritance tax wants to steal it from your children, monopoly capitalism wants to push you from the market and buy the remains for less than it's worth, and behind all of these are the Jews. This National Front grew in size and popularity, but still remained upon the fringes of Swiss politics. The Simon Wiesenthal Centre estimates that they may have had a membership of 25,000 people or so. In 1932, however, ultimate control over the Swiss National Front is handed from Fonville to the newly appointed Landesgruppenleiter of the National Socialist Party for the district of Switzerland, Wilhelm Gustloff. Fonville takes up the mantle of the leader of the Iron Broom movement, the armed wing of the National Front, also known as the Grey Shirts, before ultimately moving to Freiburg, where he is interned by the Gestapo, held for a year, and unsurprisingly afterwards is cured of his National Socialism. For Gustloff, in his isolated retreat, he felt as if he were riding a wave of success. The potential to have an impact on Swiss politics, to impose the words of Hitler and the ideals of National Socialism were within his grasp. Yet when journeying into the other cantons of Switzerland, these spells were broken. The fragmented nature of Switzerland, not only in its canton structure, but also in its languages, meant there was no singular wave to ride. That was until the 9th of November, 1932. On the 9th of November, 1932, a group of communists stormed the police station in Geneva. The resulting violence and the effort it took to clear the police building in the city resulted in the deaths of 11 rioters. But the failed communist riot was a success for the parties whose rhetoric spoke of the dangers of Bolshevism. Little more than 2 months later, on the 30th of January 1933, Gustloff's 38th birthday, the German President Paul von Hindenburg, at the behest of the dictator of Prussia Franz von Papen, appointed Adolf Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany. Hitler's words of the dangers of Bolshevism, fueling the Red Terror, rang within Switzerland also, especially when he combined Bolshevism with the international Jewish conspiracy. Theodor Fischer of the League of National Socialist Confederates, one of the many NS parties in the Swiss cantons, spoke in Freiburg. Switzerland is a vassal state of France and a Jewish protectorate. Germans, be thankful to that mother who produced that German hero Adolf Hitler, who will deliver us from our greatest peril. The international Jewish conspiracy and Fischer's claims were, of course, an outright lie, created to deceive and play upon the fears of citizens, bringing them closer to the National Socialist fold. However, it was these Swiss cantons that posed the biggest threat to the National Socialist movement in Switzerland. One of the things that Gustloff hadn't counted on was the individuality of the cantons. This despite the Germany that Gustloff had left being also a state subdivided into kingdoms and principalities. But in Germany there had always run the idea of the German, even if there was no state. Goethe mused on it, as did Hegel and Marx. But Switzerland was a smorgasbord of individuality, as well as political parties. In April 1933, Gustloff attempted to bring the National Socialist aligned parties of the Swiss cantons together into a so-called Kampfbund, if only for one day, called the Frontenfrühling, or the Frontier Spring. This day, however, serves to be a reminder of the difficulties Gustloff still faced. At its very core, National Socialism was a centralized dictatorship. Power emanated from one man, Hitler, whom had a vision that power would then be spread from Berlin. This was exemplified in Albert Speer's grandiose and delusional plans for Welthauptstadt Germania to be built on top of the German capital. Yet these ideas did not suit the National Socialist parties of Switzerland, whom, fragmented into their cantons, could find cause in their shared beliefs, but however still found little cause to cooperate together. Jean-Marie Musi, the Swiss Minister of Finance, would proclaim of Switzerland's dedication to democracy. Switzerland will either remain a democracy or cease to be Switzerland. This he proclaimed on the 10th of May 1933, before becoming a National Socialist himself shortly afterwards, before reverting shortly before the Second World War's end. So much for his own dedication towards democracy. But in Switzerland, the mood began to swing again. The Swiss government introduced a ban in May 1933 on Nazi uniforms and insignias, and the ebb and flow of popularity of National Socialism returned to a low in September 1933 when, in the Zurich local elections, the National Front won only 10 seats out of 120. The mood had shifted once again. Whilst much of the Western world remained hesitant at worst, in admiration at best of Hitler and his quick solutions for the German economy, and ignorant to his political coup that came from the Reichstag fire and subsequent demolition of democracy, Switzerland already was beginning to fear their northern neighbour. By October 1933, Minister of Defence Rudolf Minger requested the first instalment of a pot of funds that totalled 120 million francs. The money, naturally, was for improving Switzerland's military. Minger was able to claim these funds as he quite rightly claimed that Germany had a plan to invade. This plan was later formalised, with Hitler even admitting it to Mussolini in 1941 as Operation Tannenbaum. The sentiment in Switzerland toward Germany and Germans quickly shifted. One National Socialist member, the geographer and pan-German historian Dr. Ewald Banzer, would write in 1934.
From the military point of view, therefore, the character of the German Swiss is the decisive factor. This, like the old German character, is grounded in common sense and is of a very independent mind, enterprising, tough, and reserved. Its decisive features, however, are a calculating materialism, unlimited self-reliance, and a tendency to criticism, not to say fault-finding. The latter tendency is directed mainly towards their German kinsfolk across the Rhine, and reminds us of the pelican who pecks its own breast. This anti-German feeling is so strong that even in peacetime the German tourist is worse treated in German Switzerland than the British, the French, and now the American tourist.
Notice how Banzer refers to German Switzerland rather than the German-speaking area of Switzerland. This becomes a common theme amongst the National Socialist commentators and departments. In Berlin, the cooling of the Swiss towards National Socialism had not gone unnoticed. On the initiative of Gregor Strasser, the Auslandorganisation der Nationalsozialistischen Deutschen Arbeiterpartei was founded. The Foreign Organisation. This foreign organisation, placed under the helm initially of Hans Nieland, was in 1933 transferred to Ernst Wilhelm Buller. Yet it did not fall under the command of the Berlin government. Rather, as an organisation, it fell under the command of the party, and in particular, Rudolf Hess, who functioned as the conduit for Hitler. Functioning in this manner as a party arm rather than a governmental wing meant it was immune to the red tape of bureaucracy and diplomacy. Its principal purpose, however, was simple. It functioned to bring all the German-speaking peoples under one state. Ewald Banzer once again.
One is indeed filled with the shame that there are offshoots of German blood who do not consider the fact that they speak German as proof that they belong to the German people. Quite naturally, we count you, Swiss, as offshoots of the German nation, along with the Dutch, the Flemings, the Lorrainers, the Alsatians, the Austrians, the Bohemians. And I hope you will one day see fulfilled the prophecy of our K.F. Mayer. I say our because you are not worthy of him. Patience. The day approaches when a single tent will shelter the German people. Patience. One day we will group ourselves around a single banner, and whoever shall wish to separate us will be exterminated.
In the summer of 1934, the representatives of the Auslandorganisationen were summoned to Berlin. Willy Kuhn represented Chile, Otto Bini, Great Britain, Otto Langmann, Guatemala, Adolf Marr, Ireland, Walter Donat, Japan, Erwin Ettel, Colombia, Hans Bernhard, Poland, and Wilhelm Gustloff, for Switzerland. Hitler was not in attendance himself, but rather presented Rudolf Hess with his commands to be relayed to the assembled group. These commands read,
"My first demand from you, therefore, is blind obedience. You are not the judges of what is to be done in your district. Neither shall I always be in position to explain to you in detail what my intention is. Your obedience is the fruit of your trust in me. As a front line of our German fighting movement, you will make it possible for us to complete the occupation of our positions and to open fire. You have all the functions that we, the older men, carried out in the last war. You are the army's outposts. You will have to prepare definitive enterprises far in advance of the front. You will have to mask our own preparations for attack. It is a good idea to have at least 2 German societies in every country. One of them can always call attention to its loyalty to the country in question and will have the function of fostering social and economic connections. The other one may be radical and revolutionary. It will have to be prepared to be frequently repudiated by myself and other German authorities. I want to make it quite clear, too, that I make no distinction between German nationals and Germans by birth who are citizens of a foreign country. It will depend on you, gentlemen, whether we reach our goal with cooperative ease and without bloodshed. You must prepare the ground. Germany will spread its might far beyond its borders in the east as well as in the southeast. We do not seek equality, but mastery. We shall not waste time over minority rights and other such ideological abortions of sterile democracy. If you succeed, then you too will be called to leadership, unhampered by agreements and legal red tape. You shall be my viceroys in the countries and among the people who today persecute and oppress you. What has been our handicap? Splitting the century-long impotence of the German Reich. Having millions of the best Germans to emigrate and become the cultural fertilizer for other countries. This is now our pride. Just as the Jews became the all-embracing world power they are today only in their dispersal, so shall we today, as the true chosen people of God, become in our dispersal the omnipresent power, the masters of the earth."
It took little time for Hitler's speech to make an impact. On the 25th of July 1934, Engelbert Dollfuss, Chancellor of Austria, was assassinated by National Socialists. Those who committed the crime were promptly arrested and executed. But in Germany, they were not proclaimed as rogue agents or wayward members. Rather, they were lifted and heralded as martyrs of the National Socialist cause. Violence preceded National Socialist takeovers, and the Swiss were becoming wise to such endeavours. Erich May in Switzerland led a force similar to the Austrian Legion that had its base in Bavaria and who, when Hitler's forces invaded Austria, were the vanguard of the Anschluss. May led expatriates, their objective to incorporate the 2.8 million German Swiss into their organisation. The Swiss government was quick to react, promptly banning their wearing of uniforms. Hitler, for public appearance, told them to obey, but when May's troops continued to wear them, the Swiss complained and Hitler decried his helplessness in the matter, thus putting to work the process he outlined in the speech to the Auslandorganisation. Gustloff's power nevertheless was waning. The Swiss were moving against the organisation more rapidly than he could have imagined, yet he still held significant sway. Davos, as we have established, was an enclave of Germans within Switzerland, and now Gustloff lorded over them. Many had moved to the mountains for health cures, like Gustloff. Others had moved for a freer and easier life. Some had moved to escape the harsh regime that National Socialism imposed. But it was that harsh system, that system of brutality, that Gustloff now exploited to his own advantage. Gustloff, despite not having the Gestapo present in Switzerland, could still use its powers. Those who fell foul of him quite easily could be reported to the Gestapo officers nearest the border posts. Thus they could become trapped in Switzerland. But only so far as their passports remained valid, something else that Gustloff controlled. Gustloff, existing outside of diplomatic channels, harassed the local population into acquiescence. And those that further resisted, those that did not fall into line, faced the wrath of the grey shirts. Soon, the numbers of the once faltering National Socialist representation in Switzerland began to grow. Soon, there were 5,000 members of the party out of 100,000 German citizens living in Switzerland. With this, the party organizations, long since established in the Reich, were transposed to the cantons. Hitlerjugend, Bund Deutscher Mädel, Frauenarbeitsgemeinschaft, all were established. Subversive organizations were also established. The Landsverband der Deutschen Studentenschaft was created as an intelligence network of German university students studying in Switzerland. Taught to inform on their fellow man, especially other German students, they were to monitor activities and report back to Gustloff. Lists were drawn up of sympathizers, Jews, potential enemies, for when the day of Switzerland's fall to National Socialism to be enacted upon first. Much like the lists that saw the members of the Social Democrats and Communists rounded up on the night of the Reichstag fire in 1933. Switzerland was wise to these efforts of Germany. Yet once again the economy played a part in their decisions not to act, and to allow Gustloff's state within a state to continue. Germany, as it had done prior, held enormous economic sway again over Switzerland. In the good years of the Weimar Republic, Switzerland had invested heavily in Germany. But when the Wall Street crash happened, and whilst America desperately recalled its loans, Germany had frozen the assets of Switzerland in its banks. Now Hitler held power over these investments, and the Swiss walked the fine line of appeasement. Hitler, however, was not only interested in the Swiss investments at home, he was also interested in the German holdings within Swiss banks. The Reich flight tax had been enacted by decree by Paul von Hindenburg to stem capital flight from the German Reich in 1929. It made it illegal for Germans to stash their money abroad, and if discovered, the culprits were to be sentenced to at least 3 months incarceration. The Nazis were desperate now to know whom held a bank account in Switzerland. So later that same year, 1934, a former bank clerk and vagabond, whom upon the foundation of the Geheimstaatspolizei had found a role suitable to his liking, he meandered his way into Switzerland. His name, Georg Thomé. Tasked with discovering those German citizens with Swiss bank accounts, Thomé used his knowledge of the banking system, along with multiple other nefarious tricks, to weasel his way into the banking organizations. He gathered lists, names, account numbers, and forwarded them all to Berlin. For those who had discovered, the Gestapo knock came soon after. Visits to number 8 Albrechtstrasse and other detention centres followed, all whilst official requests in the arrested names were made to transfer the wealth from Switzerland to German-held accounts. Those accounts were subsequently seized by the state. For those arrested, transfers then arrived, transfers of themselves to the numerous camps that were being established across Germany. Quickly, however, the Swiss banks and government grew wise. This threat from abroad against the Swiss banks was treated as an act not only against the people, but the Swiss economy. Quickly, Switzerland enacted a new article, Article 47, which would become the basis of the trust in the Swiss banking system later, and would make disclosing information or activity of clients of banking domestically to foreign entities, third parties, or even Swiss authorities a federal crime. George Thomé, realizing his mission has little chance of now succeeding, flees. Switzerland was at loggerheads with its National Socialist neighbour to the north, whilst also having to deal with the cascade of ideology that spewed south from the never-ending diarrhea of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry. As the Nazis grew more confident in their cementing of power, so their abhorrent rhetoric and persecution increased, which in turn had an influence on the Swiss parties styled after that of the National Socialist Party. In the same year that Thomé fled from Switzerland, a trial was also taking place in Bern. It was a trial billed as one of the Jewish people versus the National Socialists. In 1933, the National Front and its extreme arm, the Iron Broom, had distributed the fraudulent anti-Semitic text, the Protocols of Zion. This text had first appeared amongst the pogroms of Russia of 1902 to 1903. It was a text that dreamt up an idea of a secretive Jewish world order completely based in fantasy. Yet many right-wing parties took the fabrication as fact, the National Front included. The Israelitische Kulturgemeinde Bern naturally took offence to this blatant provocation and sued the Bund National Socialistische Erdgenossen and its president, Theodor Fischer, at Zurich. When the court first sat in the sessions of 29th of October 1934, members of the Jewish community, along with National Socialist Party members, sat to watch the proceedings take place. Wilhelm Gustloff sat amongst the crowd. So interesting was the case that it drew in a young man who formerly presented no interest in politics. He was round-faced, hair combed to the side, with deep-set eyes. Dressed in a suit and tie, he bore the marks of the respectable student of medicine that he was. His name, David Frankfurter. David Frankfurter was born into the Austrian-Hungarian Empire on the 9th of July, 1909, in the town of Daruva. His family of Austrian stock had made a decision to move from the Austrian heartland towards the outreaches of the empire many years prior to David's birth. The generations that had come before David had been scholars, philosophers, scientists, even like his father Mavro, rabbis. For the young David, great things were expected. Yet quickly the path ahead for David seemed to get diverted. At the age of just 6, after the Frankfurter family had relocated to the town of Vinkovci, where Mavro became chief rabbi, David was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the bone and thus began a long journey of surgeries and excruciating pain for the young boy. David's childhood quickly went from one of adventure to one of solitude. Forced to remain inside, David surrounded himself with the books of his father's library, studying the Jewish texts and philosophies alike. Whilst David struggled, his parents worried about the life he might lead and for how long. David, however, had so much worries. Growing in confidence in his own will to survive, David would put all his mental strength towards the study of medicine, and especially cancer. The young man Frankfurter travelled to Frankfurt to enroll as a medical student, but soon he required the university's facilities to perform an operation on himself. The TB of the bone was attacking his mastoids, a part of the skull bone. The resulting surgery caused a loss of hearing in one ear and a reduction in the other. Pain marked his daily life and that of the night. Morphine was used to survive the day, sleeping pills to survive the night. Then came another nightmare: Hitler. Frankfurt University had been founded by esteemed members of the Jewish community. But, soon after Hitler's rise, the staff and faculty members were being harried and harassed by National Socialism. Purges of the staff took place shortly after Hitler's ascent to power. Then quickly fellow students of Frankfurters were corrupted into despotic brown shirts and degenerate mobs. For David, whose young life had been personified by solitude, the rampant anti-Semitism on the streets of Germany proved, understandably, too much to bear. He applied for a transfer to Bern. Bern was to offer Frankfurter a supposed return to a safe haven, like the island of solitude that the walls of his family home fortified and in which he matured. Switzerland was supposed to offer an equal safe haven, but on a national scale. In Bern, Frankfurter sought out the boarding house of Lini Stephan. Here Stephan notes Frankfurter focused on his studies and predominantly ignored the outside world. That was until the trial. The trial of the Jewish community versus the Nazis brought Frankfurter from his isolated shell. The veil which his parents had brought down over his eyes over 2 decades prior was finally lifting, and it was lifting on a world of inequality and heightened tensions brought on by the far right. When the trial finally resolved in favour of the Jewish community, Frankfurter was fully engulfed by politics. His waking moments dedicated to reading newspapers and political texts at local coffee houses, his studies suffering. Smoking cigarette after cigarette, he digests the tripe produced by Streicher's rag, Der Stürmer, questioning his own worldview and fearing the effect the Nazis might have. For as easy as it was to get a copy of Der Stürmer, it cemented how easy it was for the long right arm of German National Socialism to reach into Switzerland. In the following year, the Gestapo were once again involved in an act of subversion that caused an outrage in Switzerland. In 1935, Hans Wesemann, German journalist and a Gestapo agent in Switzerland, betrays his old friend and newspaper editor Berthold Solomon. Solomon was an old thorn in the side of the Nazis whom had reared his head again that year. From his home in Strasbourg, France, Solomon had published detailed plans of the rearmament intended for Germany by Hitler's regime. Weizmann lured Solomon to Bern to celebrate Fastnacht, the last night before the beginning of Lent. It's a festival of culture, colour and vitality. But for Solomon, it quickly turned into a nightmare. Weizmann, along with a handful of Gestapo agents, chloroformed Solomon, dragged him into an awaiting car, and quickly smuggled him across the border into Germany. First, Solomon was smuggled to Weil am Rhein on the 9th of March. Then, he was quickly forwarded on to Berlin. Despite the speed of the kidnapping, the Swiss authorities had been alerted with haste and quickly protested. Weizmann was arrested at the lakeside town of Ascona in Switzerland's south and quickly confessed to his part and knowledge of the plan. Finally, the Swiss had leverage. Weizmann had not only informed of the details of the plan, but on the high-ranking Gestapo officers involved, and thus the very prestige of the organization and the German Reich, were now bartering chips. In Davos, such is the anger at the ignorance towards Swiss sovereignty by Germany and the NSDAP, the locals turned toward Gustloff. The NSDAP apparatus is harried and harassed by enraged citizens. Newspapers intentionally ironically proclaim Gustloff as the warden of the state of Switzerland, and that he is the oppressor of freedom who fills the air with pestilence. Many now ask the question, why was Gustloff permitted to stay? Dr. Gaudenz Canova of Gersens asked of the Bundesrat on the 3rd of April 1935.
1. That Wilhelm Gustloff, a German citizen, also a former official of the Swiss Meteorological Institute in Davos and currently the Gauleiter of the National Socialist Party for District of Switzerland, is instantly provoking the democratically minded Swiss and also is threatening and harassing foreigners who come for medical and recreational purposes. 2. That Wilhelm Gustloff has established in Switzerland German support groups which are military in character and whose leaders obligate the members to swear allegiance to Hitler. And 3. That Wilhelm Gustloff displays Hitler's banners during the rallies and that members wear Nazi uniforms.
Heinrich Rothmund, the leader of the Fremdenpolizei, had the power to expel Gustloff, but he himself was answerable to the minister Baumann. Baumann was little interested in the fate of Solomon, nor was he at all interested in expelling Gustloff. Rather, when Gustloff, according to Ernst von Weizsäcker, was slandered in Parliament, Baumann came to his defence. With considerable pressure exerted over Germany, Switzerland was finally, after 6 months, successful on the 17th of September 1935 in obtaining Solomon's return. But Solomon had been horrifically tortured by the Gestapo and was left scarred by the incident. His ordeal was also not over. Upon his return, the Swiss authorities blamed Solomon for the incident. They laboured with him false charges of wanting to obtain a false passport and engaging in intelligence work. The Swiss government enacted Article 70 and expelled Solomon back to France. Gustloff was left unaffected by the state, by the incident. But the citizens remembered. Slowly, the death threats started to arrive at Kurland 3, Gustloff's home in Davos. But the mountain air had long since gone to Gustloff's head. Safe in his Swiss mountain state, he refused the offer of police protection from the Swiss state. Perhaps a fatal mistake. Just 2 days prior to Berthold Jakob Salomon's extradition from Switzerland, the National Socialist regime had passed in Nuremberg the laws that would begin the persecution of the Jews of Germany by every means of the state apparatus. For Frankfurter and many other residents in Switzerland, a greater fear was distilled within. Feelings that were certainly not eased as long as the Nazi-sympathetic Baumann was in office and Gustloff was in his mountain retreat. As 1935 draws to a close, and Europe appears to be continuing on its spiral towards a dark fate, Frankfurter meets with a fellow student and friend, a philosophy student. Over newspapers and cigarettes they debate the coming course for Europe, and the impact that the Nazis like Gustloff are to have on them and the fabric of the continent. It is during this discussion that Frankfurter's fellow student produces before him a small gun. It's a sign of being prepared for the times ahead, but holding the small gun in his hand, Frankfurter feels empowered. Before the thought had never crossed his mind to own such a weapon. Now he wants one for himself. A short trip, a quick exchange of 10 francs, and Frankfurter is now the owner of a Browning revolver. Proud, he shows his new purchase to Linny at the boarding house. This gun, this small piece of metal clasped in the hand of his failing body, now becomes a tool for Frankfurter to have an impact on the world rather than the surgeon's knife. The 30th of January brings celebrations in Germany as Hitler, the National Socialist Party, and its organisations celebrate 3 years in power. In Bern, Frankfurter prepares. How long can the world go on entertaining and tolerating these National Socialists who bring so much hatred and persecution down on others, especially upon the Jewish people, he questions. When the next morning comes, Linny Steffen finds a note in the bed, occupied by Frankfurter.
Dear Linny, I will not be back tonight. Details later. Cordially yours, David.
Linny's first instinct is to search the drawer within which she knew David kept his revolver. But the revolver was not there. She knew David had been depressed, struggling with the world. The revolver his new tool, she feared that its purpose was to be used upon himself. As Linny puzzled as what to do, David was on a train to Zurich. From Zurich he transferred onto a local train that would wind its way slowly up the slopes. Yet as he travels, he questions his purpose for going to Davos, to strike at the heart of the National Socialist representation in Switzerland. It is only in having a short conversation with the train's conductor, who himself is perturbed by the Nazis in Switzerland, that his resolve turns steely. Carrying only a briefcase, the revolver and 6 bullets and his sleeping pills stashed safely inside, David Frankfurter walks into the quaint Hotel Leuven that sits beneath the twisting spire of St. Johann in Davos. The following day, 1st of February 1936, Frankfurter wanders around the meandering streets. Davos, just 50 years before, was little more than a couple of homes and a church. Now it had grown, although it remained a far way away from being counted a large settlement. But it was a settlement, nevertheless, that had a strange air to it. It was an air that was summarised by the sign outside a typical 3-storey chalet building. It simply pointed and read, Director of the National Socialist Party for the District of Switzerland, a sign that resolved the doubts Frankfurter had and cast him further upon his course. Back in Bern, Linny has finally become beyond worried. She had refrained from calling the attention of the police to Frankfurter's disappearance for fear how silly she might look should he walk back in, but fearing the worst, she finally reported it. On the 3rd of February, in ignorance to the police search now underway for him, Frankfurter sits at a table in the Café Metropole that occupies the ground floor of the Hotel Leuven. Here, smoking away, he writes letters of goodbye to his siblings and a letter to his father.
My dearly beloved father, I have always given you much sorrows and worry and little joy. I cannot go on. Forgive me. It is not hard for me to leave this life, knowing that you will never doubt my boundless love for you and my blessed mother. Be strong and trust in God as you have always done. You have Alphonse and Joe, Ruth and Naomi, who will still give you much pleasure. I have lost my faith in myself and mankind. I cannot go on. My last wish is that you say Kaddish for me. I hope soon to be united with my dear Mamma before God's judgment seat. Be strong, you and the children. May God in his mercy give you and all Israel a better fate. Farewell, your unhappy son, David.
His next steps after finishing his pack of cigarettes is to write the plan ahead of him out on the empty packet.
The sentence must be carried out on Monday, 3rd of February at 9:30 a.m. First call up and ask if he is at home. If he does not come out and cannot be seen, attempt to escape. Otherwise go through with the suicide. 1 or 2 shots in the chest. Revolver in right hand pocket of jacket, not of overcoat. Ready to fire. As soon as I am in the room, suddenly pull it out, fire 3 shots at his head or chest.
Almost as soon as he's finished writing the plan, he disregards it. 9:30 a.m. passes by and so does the day. Frankfurter only making a visit to a Jewish sanatorium, pretending he is looking for a place to continue his medical studies once graduated. On the 4th, however, indecision turns to action. Disregarding the plans of the previous day, Frankfurter decides to walk to the building which was pointed to as the director of the National Socialist Party for the district of Switzerland. Night has already settled in on the Alpine town, and the moonlight on the snow guides Frankfurter's way. Ringing the doorbell at the Alpine chalet at Kurpark, Frankfurter commits. From above, a woman's voice cries down, asking, "Who is it?" Frankfurter exclaims he is here to see Wilhelm Gustloff. A few moments later, the door opens, and the thin, drawn face of Hedwig Gustloff appears. She opens the door and guides Frankfurter into the study, asking him to wait. Nerves start to eat away at Frankfurter. In the pocket of his jacket, he thumbs and fingers the revolver. Now, however, he is committed. The first acts have played out. Now for the finale. Gustloff, balding, plumped around the midriff, with usual stern expression, enters the study, and immediately Frankfurter leaps forward. The medical student versus the Nazi, David against the Goliath of National Socialism. Whipping from his pocket the revolver, Frankfurter levies it at Gustloff as he walks, and casually pulls the trigger. A click, but no bang. Gustloff, stunned, looks bemused. Frankfurter even more so. Another click, no bang. Gustloff charges. Arms outstretched, he leaps at Frankfurter's throat, wrapping his hands around Frankfurter's neck. David desperately toys with the gun still in his hand. He realizes his mistake. Whilst thumbing the revolver, he'd knocked the barrel loose. Now he squeezes it back into place whilst Gustloff tries to draw the very life out of him. The tables turn from Frankfurter's intent. There's a metal ringing as a bullet falls from the revolver as David pushes the barrel. Then a click. Holding the gun against Gustloff's belly, Frankfurter, head swaying, eyes bulging, pulls on the trigger with utter panic. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5. 4 bullets fire Gustloff off of Frankfurter. The 5th lodges in the wall. Gustloff rattles his last breaths as Hedwig appears in the doorway and shrieks. Snapping from the reaction to his act, Frankfurter flees. Into the night he runs, away from the town, his intent to levy the gun on himself. Now out in the plateau below the town, he washes his face with snow to cleanse himself and bring calm. Holding the gun to his temple, he pulls the trigger. Click. A click now all too familiar to him. He looks at the barrel. No bullets remain. Now he is fearful. He didn't want his act to be classified as a random act. His assassination of Gustloff, in his mind, was for the good of everyone. His body was to be a testament to the desperation that lay ahead if action was not taken against the National Socialists. But without the final bullet, there was little he could do. Frankfurter walked back into Davos and walked to the building next door to where he had committed his act. He asked the residents if he might use their phone to call the police. They obliged. Ultimately, David's impatience caused him not to wait for the detectives dispatched, but rather he then walked to the police station in Davos, presented the gun to the desk man, and was promptly brought into custody. Reaction. Hitler, preparing for the Winter Games across the border in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, was in a pickle. The world was descending on the Alpine town. It had only recently been cleansed of its anti-Semitic propaganda that had been plastered among the streets, not only of that town, but across the Reich. The period of 1936 for the Jews of Germany, and for the mindset of the Jews of the world, was one of relaxation. The anti-Semitism was dropped in favour of a positive image upon the world stage. Now with an assassination on his hands, the head of the National Socialist outpost in Switzerland, the Gauleiter of the so-called district of Switzerland, dead, a Jewish assassin confessing to the murder, Hitler had to steady his own hand. He could not unleash the chained bulldog that was Streicher, nor the SA or the ever-growing in power SS. For to do so would undermine the work done in bringing the world to Germany, a different approach, perhaps not diplomatic, but certainly not reactionary in terms of what the National Socialist regime was capable of. Instead, Hitler, Goebbels and Streicher decided to leverage the power of the press. 2 birds might be slaughtered with 1 stone. Blame the crime not only on the Jewish, but claim that the ability to commit such an act was a result of the left-leaning press whom had inspired such an act, and whom had derided Gustloff. It was a successful ploy not only at home, but also abroad. The American Literary Digest wrote,
Gustloff, a German physicist attached to the Davos Observatory, for some time had irritated Swiss socialists by organising Germans in Switzerland in support of Hitler. Because he gave assurances of his respect for Swiss neutrality, the authorities decided he could remain in Switzerland. The leftist Swiss press, however, had long demanded his expulsion on the ground that he did not fulfill his promises to the government.
So successful was the Nazi campaign against the left-leaning press, and once again, so fearful the Swiss government was of a strong reprisal against their borders and economy, the Swiss Minister of Foreign Affairs, Giuseppe Motta, bowed to the pressure of the ambassador Ernst von Weizsäcker. Motta, on the 6th of February, had 2 of the leading socialist newspapers banned, disbanding the very nature of the freedom of the press.
Der Schweizer Landesgruppenleiter der NSDAP, Wilhelm Gustloff, fiel einem ruchlosen Mordanschlag zum Opfer.
Gustloff's body was transported from Davos to his hometown of Schwerin in Mecklenburg. On the 12th of February, the newest martyr of the National Socialist cause was laid in the ground. The eulogy delivered by Hitler.
Wir begreifen die Kampfansage und wir nehmen sie auf. Mein lieber Parteigenosse, du bist nicht Opfersgewalt.
Gustloff had not fallen in vain. The Jewish assassin had not foreseen that when he killed one, he awakened in the far distant future millions and millions of comrades to a true German life. Every foreign group of the National Socialist now had its National Socialist patron, its holy martyr to the movement and its ideal. Everyone would carry his name in their hearts and never more forget it. It is not Germany that is weakened, but the power which committed this deed. The German people had lost one of the living in the year 1936, but had gained an immortal for the future.
In Germany, the idea of attacks against the Jewish people was levied as a way of penance for Gustloff's assassination. But the idea was waylaid for 2 years, for fear of a similar tax being levied against Germans living abroad. That was until the death of Ernst von Rath and the orchestration of Reich's Pogromnacht, otherwise known as Kristallnacht. Switzerland did finally, on the 18th of February, ban the National Socialist Party. They also sought to reduce the influence of other foreign nations' parties on Swiss soil. On the 9th of December 1936, after the Winter and Summer Olympics had passed, Germany had reoccupied the Rhineland, and Gustloff's memory had already faded. The trial of David Frankfurter began in Switzerland and relaunched Hitler and the National Socialist vehement attack on the Jewish people of Germany and the world. But the world did not care. The world still held its head firmly in the sand in regards to the dangers that National Socialism presented. Even many aspects of Jewish society disregarded Frankfurter, claiming the immorality of murder cannot be supported, despite the victim's political ideology and dangerous persuasion towards humanity as a whole. It was a trial that only the Swiss and the Germans cared over. For Frankfurter, whose statement was a hope that others might act in the reduction of the heads of the poisonous hydra that was National Socialism, and that the world might look to why a drastic act was undertaken, his cause fell on deaf ears. The world did not care. The occupation of the Rhineland earlier in 1936 proved thus, and as the earth carried on spinning, the nations whom proclaimed that they carried the swords and shields of democracy allowed the boots of the goose-stepping troops to continue their march over broken glass, borders, and rights. Frankfurter was given the maximum sentence of 18 years asked for by the prosecutors. All subsequent appeals were denied. Frankfurter's father, a rabbi, and for whom murder was a cardinal sin, disowned him. With Frankfurter in prison, the Swiss and the Germans looked to move on from the affair. Soon Frankfurter was forgotten, and any desire to reduce the impact of National Socialism in Switzerland was also forgotten, as Switzerland looked to appeasing its northern neighbour. Gustloff's position, despite the ban on the National Socialist Party in Switzerland, was occupied by Sigismund von Bibra as Gauleiter. Von Bibra ruled over the Germans in Switzerland with an iron fist, more so than Gustloff. If they, the German people, did not join the party, their passports might well be cancelled. Even Rothmann and his Fremdenpolizei did not dare to interfere. Rothmann, in fact, helped to ensure anti-Semitic policies were enforced. On the 17th of September 1938, the political office in Bern received a telegram. It was a telegram from the Interior Ministry in Berlin. The subject was quite simple. It was a suggestion that all German passports, that is, all passports belonging to the so-called Aryan population of Germany, have the three words stamped upon them, valid for Switzerland, thus identifying and denying the German Jews who wished to flee. The suggestion came from Hans Globke. This ultimately was refused, not because the idea to the Swiss was insulting, but rather because Rothmund had already come up with a much simpler solution. Stamp the passports of all Jewish people with a large letter J. This J became the barrier not only to Switzerland, but to many nations of the world who considered themselves liberal and free, and therefore became a death sentence to the Jewish people. The Swiss newspaper Beobachter would claim it was not Rothmund who implicated this, but historians and Rothmund's own position as chief of the border police, who regularly and committedly denied Jewish people access to Switzerland, begged to differ. David Frankfurter was released early from prison in 1945. He had survived, confined in a cell while so many people outside had perished. Upon his release, he was deported to Palestine, where later, upon the founding of the State of Israel, he became an employee of the Ministry of Defense, and where he also, in 1982, would die. For Wilhelm Gustloff, a memorial would be erected near the banks of the Schweriner See, although long since and thankfully destroyed. Gustloff's legacy as a man is one of hate and intolerance, as is any and all whom belong to the National Socialist Party, be it in Germany or Switzerland. They lay the groundwork for the horrors that would unfold as the Shoah or the Holocaust. Gustloff is, however, remembered. He is remembered for where we began, on the dock walls of Hamburg, as Hedwig Gustloff and Adolf Hitler launched the KDF ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff. A ship that was to sail the seas bedecked in the swastika, taking Germans to Norway, Portugal, the Mediterranean. The first propaganda video from which you can see on the Achtung History Patreon at patreon.com/AchtingHistory, upscaled and restored. But it was a ship that bore the worst of fates, as it became the worst loss of life in maritime history when an estimated 10,000 people went with the ship to the bottom of the Baltic. It sank on what would have been her namesake's birthday, the 30th of January, 1945. Thank you for listening to the Achtung History podcast, written and presented by myself, Simon J. James. Over the coming months, I'll be taking a closer look at the Kraft der Freude, its leaders, as well as the fate of the ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff. If you'd like to learn more about Hans Globke, the architect of the persecution of Europe's Jews, listen to my very first series, He Who Holds the Devil. Equally, if you have also enjoyed this episode, please take the time to leave a review on whichever platform you enjoy podcasts on, and share it with your friends and family. You can also reach me directly through the Achtung History subreddit at r/Achtung History, where I will post pictures and updates. And thank you most of all to all those who inquired about the podcast over the last 15 months. Your reaching out brings a lot of support to myself and gives me the spur to continue writing and producing this show. So until next time, thank you and ta-ta.